This is Inform Your Resistance with Political Research Associates, or PRA. Tune in monthly to hear experts, researchers, journalists, academics, and movement strategists explain some of the most significant contemporary threats to democracy from the mainstream and far right. With Inform Your Resistance, we distill what you need to know most. I'm your host, Koki Mendes, Communications Director here at PRA.
I'm Ben Lorber, Senior Research Analyst at PRA, and I'm filling in for Koki Mendes. Today I sat down with Stephen Gardner, Principal Research Advisor, as well as Annie Wilkinson and Ethan Foray, Senior Research Analysts, to talk about ICE's deadly crackdown in Minneapolis and the powerful resistance that we've seen on the streets. Now, with the kidnapping of thousands and the brutal murders of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, the brutality of this authoritarian administration is on full display for all to see. But so is the power of everyday people who are organizing in neighborhoods and street corners, at airports and at their city hall, to defend their neighbors and their communities, to grind business as usual to a halt, and to show the entire country and the world exactly what it takes to stand up in this moment. In our conversation, we take a deep dive into what brought us here, the decades-long advance of today's anti-immigrant movement, and the strategies of repression and fear that lie behind the authoritarian playbook. And we also lift up what the resistance in Minneapolis can teach all of us as we sharpen our own strategies to block the right and build towards a better future. We recorded this on Friday, January 30th. Thank you for listening. Stephen, Ethan, and Annie, thank you all so much for coming on.
Great to be here, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So our job at PRA is to inform your resistance by analyzing the threats, the trends, the contradictions on the right. And we're going to get there, but I want to start actually by looking at the strength of our own resistance. You know, over the weekend when Alex Preddy was murdered, I published a piece in Religion Dispatches that looked at what happened when a right-wing provocateur named Cam Higbee, quote-unquote, infiltrated an unvetted signal chat used by anti-ICE organizers in Minneapolis. And Cam Higbee published all these screenshots of signal threads of neighbors organizing, mutual aid and organizing ICE Watch. And it was remarkable that all over the right, very quickly, they kind of had a unified chorus of fear. They said, the left is infinitely more organized than we are. There's no way that we can approach this level of coordination. They clearly saw that they couldn't replicate this, that they have nothing like this. And, on the one hand, the right is adept at magnifying the threat, at painting this kind of all-powerful spiritual portrait of, a hidden enemy who's behind the scenes. So, there's definitely some of that going on there as well.
Well, this is part of this systematic devaluing of anything that is not created through capitalism, that people are not paid to do. It's almost like they can't see it, so they can't believe it. It's almost like, housework or childcare.
Yeah, exactly. I also detected, a real note of envy. Like, in some sense, I could tell they were jealous and they were scared. They knew that they didn't have the kind of people power that we do. And I've often seen this monitoring the right, that, very often they are jealous of our ideas, of our vision, of our organizing, of our deep rootedness in, communities, of the thing that's called solidarity, that allows neighbors to just show up for each other so consistently. So Annie, I want to ask you, I know you've done a lot of organizing against ICE here in Chicago, and you've been following closely what's happening in Minneapolis. What have you seen there that is inspiring, and what are the lessons that we can take from it?
Thanks for the question, Ben. I really appreciated the article that you published on this in Religion Dispatches, and I completely agree with you. I think that they're right to be both impressed and afraid by the power and the level of organizing that we're seeing coming out of Minneapolis. Minnesotans are showing us all the power of organized communities and how powerful we are when we come together. One thing that story that stands out to me is that, folks on the ground have been talking about how, even in a city with a painful history of racial injustice and, racial segregation and class segregation, everyone is coming together, united in defense of one another. And I think they're really showing us what the power of an organized community that is invested in defending each other and defending their neighbors looks like. And that's not to say that, these occupations haven't caused incredible pain and loss that is, really unrecoverable, that we have to grieve, but it has also united us. It has galvanized us. And if we're paying attention, then I think we'll also see the immensity of our power. And another thing I've been thinking about in terms of, watching Minneapolis, we spent a lot of time at PRA thinking about strategy and how to effectively counter authoritarian movements. And one of the orientations that we sometimes talk about is the block and build orientation, how to block authoritarian movements and how to build multiracial democratic movements in their place, right? And one of the things that I talk about sometimes is how when we build, we are also blocking. And I think that what we see coming out of Minneapolis and Chicago and other places around the country that are occupied by federal forces is that the networks of care that communities are building, in Minneapolis, in Chicago, in Maine, everywhere, um, this is what is going to effectively block authoritarian consolidation. And that's what the right is taking away from this. And I think it's what we should take away from it too.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, Stephen, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about block and build, strategies, and what this can mean for our movements in this moment. And I also want to say that it's not just this moment. I mean, I think one thing I've heard from folks on the ground in Minneapolis is that the networks they're drawing upon now were also built in summer 2020 during the George Floyd uprising. They were also built, months before that in COVID mutual aid. So these networks, are resilient and the organizing is all, kind of cumulative. But, Stephen, what lessons, for block and build really can we learn from the resistance right now in Minneapolis?
Well, Stephen Gardner here. The block and build lesson is really that when the stakes are high enough and people are feeling urgency, they will come out in acts of profound solidarity, and they will continue to do it for as long as necessary, even under terrible, horrible conditions. I mean, we're talking about people who are out not just protesting, but who are out helping each other, identifying threats, delivering mutual aid, providing food and shelter to people, helping to coordinate and doing it spontaneously with very little organized leadership through networks. As it turns out, contrary to myth, the myth of sort of bureaucratic organization that says sort of government is the least efficient way to do things, and then business is the most, and people can't do anything for themselves. What it turns out is that when the stakes are really high, people acting spontaneously in solidarity when they see an ethical and moral obligation to their neighbors, they act, and it's incredibly efficient. It's also, of course, the idea that this unvetted signal chat was quote unquote infiltrated. I mean, this suggests some kind of high level hacking or something. No, this of course is unvetted, so anyone can join it by clicking a button and saying, yeah, I want to be on this list. And the fact that people were astonished that without funding, Signal is a free application, and all people are doing is putting down, their role and their time when they're available to do something. This doesn't cost any money. And what it really costs is people's sacrifice of their time, which is what the sort of theory of individualism says we won't do. We won't sacrifice. We won't make sacrifices for our neighbors, for our friends, for anyone who's not in the closest circle of empathy with us. And so the lesson for block and build is that there is power there that is untapped. And it's also an understanding that if you're going to mobilize people, you have to understand that they're going to mobilize themselves. And what you have to do is sort of be able to think through suggestions for what can be done beyond the obvious. And then at PRA, a lot of what our work is on the build side, on the block side, is to identify the threats that can include things like conspiracy mongering and quote unquote infiltration and so on. And then to right size those threats for people. So a lot of people are talking about, we should use a more secure application because Signal is so easy to infiltrate. I think that what people have to understand is that these signal chats are being used basically like a bulletin board, like that you would put up at the community center or the supermarket or wherever. And obviously that is easy to quote unquote infiltrate. Someone can come and take a picture of it. And this is essentially what has just happened. That doesn't mean it's bad. The fact that we are doing things, that people in Minneapolis are doing things that the right doesn't like, doesn't mean that they won't stand up to legal or political scrutiny. They will. I mean, I think this is neighbors helping neighbors, and the fact that the Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security don't like it is a matter of practical concern, but not of political or legal or moral concern.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really important, point to name. I think we'll come back to that. Just being clear on, our constitutional rights in this moment, and amidst all the fear mongering that, neighbors helping neighbors is somehow domestic terrorism. It's really important not to let that demobilize us or not to get confused that what we're doing is completely legal and, is, in accord with obviously the highest moral principles. I really appreciate also your point about, this resistance being, grassroots and not funded. I think it was really funny in a way to see how much the right instantly kind of leapt to explanations of, this is all Soros funded, or this is funded by the Chinese Communist Party, right? I do think, there's also been really inspiring stories that have come out of local unions, the Unite Here locals who have really helped out with the mutual aid, and neighborhood organizations. And so there is a role for dense civil society organizations and labor to play a role. Like, I don't think we can win, solely through grassroots volunteer power, but it's but if the right has the money power, I think they see that we have the people power, and that's really important.
And I think it's really worth naming what, some of the things that folks are doing that the federal government wants to construe as conspiracy or as domestic terrorism. And we're talking about people coming together and doing things like, local faith communities coming out after Alex Preddy's murder and cleaning up the mess of pepper balls and tear gas canisters and trash so that neighbors didn't have to wake up to the memories of what had occurred there. And, a bookstore owner who talked about his story of what he experienced and the pain of witnessing what had happened in his neighborhood. And his website crashed 24 hours later because he had so many donations and so much business. An adult store that had come together to transform itself into a donation and distribution center full time. Tow truck companies that are donating their services to pick up, the vehicles that ICE has abandoned, sometimes in cases after they've abducted someone, just leaving them in the street, in some cases even on with the car keys in them. Social workers stepping up to take in children who've come home to find that both of their parents have disappeared, and, working parents who are taking shifts outside the schools to protect their neighbors, the children and the teachers in their communities. And these are the kinds of things that the federal government wants to construe, or DHS wants to construe, as conspiratorial or as forms of domestic terrorism. And I think it's quite obvious to see how ludicrous that is. It is really worth pointing out that is what the resistance looks like. It's everyday people who are coming together, as Stephen described, to do, basic to meet basic needs, to take care of one another. And I think it is every bit as terrifying as the right seems to think that it is.
So, Ethan, I know that you've been tracking the anti-immigrant movement for a really long time and monitoring how the organizations and ideas and figures that were more marginal even a decade ago on the right now have steadily moved mainstream and are really setting the agenda at the heart of power. And the ideas animating this movement of the need to end immigration, to stop, so-called Great Replacement, the demographic decline of the white race, the extinction of the white race, the white genocide conspiracy theory. These ideas aren't new, right? They're rooted really in the founding of America on indigenous genocide, right? And in long legacies of white dominance. And at the same time, some of the organizations who are trying to shift policy more in this direction are having a real newfound resurgence in the last decade, and certainly now in this the second Trump administration. So, can you walk us through a bit who some of these actors are who have led us to this moment, and the ways in which their agenda draws from deep roots in American history and is manifesting now in really terrifying ways?
Looking back to the origins of Border Patrol as we know it, which was in the 1920s when the United States had arguably its most explicitly racist immigration policy. There were like national quota, primary, only admitting, folks of European descent for the most part. Like the 1920s, and all informed by eugenicist thinking, like out and out, like these were the folks that were testifying before Congress and informing the legislation and laws that ultimately went on the books. That's the model that the anti-immigrant movement is looking to. Like that's the past that they are trying to recreate. That's the immigration system that they want. And they've had the contemporary anti-immigrant movement. I was just thinking about it. A lot of the organizations that were founded or nurtured by the white nationalist John Tanton that emerged in the 1970s and 80s. These include the Federation for American Immigration Reform and the Center for Immigration Studies are probably the two most notable ones when we think about this. They've had some success, but it's funny to think about. Like their opposition in the 1980s was Ronald Reagan. Like they were up against Ronald Reagan and the Heritage Foundation at that time. Reagan ultimately signed a law that provided legal status to some 3 million people. And that's a massive defeat and these folks had. And it kind of reinvigorated their efforts to make the immigration restriction system more restrictive. And ultimately they succeeded in rewriting kind of all of the legal immigration system in the 1990s with bills signed into law by President Clinton. And that creates the modern architecture for the mass deportation machine. And this created the 287G program that we've seen explode recently. Like that, this is the framework that the modern immigration enforcement system is operating under. And then this was also supercharged by the national security state following the September 11th. And so, like, if we look at like the last 20 years, is really where the anti-immigrant movement has, gained more kind of not even just policy influence. I mentioned the previous laws, but a cultural influence, and really working concurrently with the rise of the MAGA movement and the Trump administration's first campaign. And that's where you see the personnel overlaps. Like Stephen Miller was working with these groups when he worked in Congress, previously with Jeff Sessions, and to bring it back to Minnesota, Representative Michelle Bachmann. Before that, like this is the cultural firmament in which this kind of like professionalized nativist class of the 21st century has emerged, and now we see them at the highest echelons of power. So that's kind of the big bit. But the perverse thing now is that a lot of these same groups can now go and say that they're presenting a moderate approach to immigration enforcement. It's not shooting civilians, shooting U.S. citizens on the streets. It's no, we want worksite enforcement, or we want eliminating the refugee resettlement program, and these other things that by comparison to, just outright violence in the streets can appear moderate. And that's something that I want to make sure we don't lose sight of in this moment, is that like the ideologies and the motivations and the policy prescriptions of the anti-immigrant movement are no less dangerous and violent than they ever have been, even if the folks that are implementing it right now are perhaps publicly a little more beyond the pale, or acting with a little less decorum than some of these professionalized organizations and lobbyist shops and think tanks would have you think that they are. But it's the same agenda through and through. It's just a variation on how you approach the notion of so-called attrition to enforcement, which has been their policy guide star.
I just wanted to pivot on that a little bit, Ethan. This is Stephen Gardner again, and to just say that in maybe a slightly pithier way, that the Walmart stormtrooper look feel of the current interior enforcement efforts makes it more spectacular, and there is a reason beyond the in the MAGA movement understanding and in the Trump regime understanding for that. But in terms of the impact on immigrants and on people's lives, it's not going to be any better if it's two guys in khakis instead who are rounding people up and dragging them off, or maybe not dragging them off, maybe just saying, "Here's my badge, come with me." I mean, which goes to the point that this is basically all that is necessary for this kind of enforcement. And it's the enforcement, it's the policies around enforcement that are part of the issue here. But there is another agenda item for the spectacular brutality that we're seeing, which is to desensitize people to the use of force in creating a more powerful government, more powerful federal government with its own secret-ish security force that can commit violence on citizens. It can kill citizens. And the first thought isn't to apologize or to say, we'll investigate this, but to accuse anyone in opposition, they must be a terrorist, or otherwise they wouldn't be killed. So that part of generating fascistic or authoritarian centralization grounded in a celebration of violence is somewhat different domestically for the United States. Of course, this has been part of U.S. Military foreign policy for a long time, however we might deny it. But domestically, this is the kind of enforcement, quote unquote enforcement. This is a kind of warfare, counterinsurgency warfare that's been directed against Black folk, that has been directed against indigenous folk in this country. And now we're just seeing it spreading to neighborhoods in Minneapolis that are not all Black.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Stephen. This is Annie Wilkinson. And it really, your comments give us an opportunity to do something that I think is really important, which is to tease apart two overlapping but distinct projects that we need to understand are behind the occupation efforts of U.S. cities by DHS, by federal agents. And the first is one that Ethan described and outlined in detail, which is the white nationalist project that seeks to maintain white supremacy, right? It sees immigration and people of color as threats to that vision that then need to be, are marked for subordination or removal. And this is a project that has been ever present in U.S. history. It may ebb and it flows and it takes different, it manifests in different ways, but this is a longstanding impetus behind this immigration enforcement effort. But the other that I think you're surfacing, Stephen, is this bid for authoritarian consolidation of power that's using this opportunistically, using this opportunity to scapegoat immigrants. Trans people are, I think, another important scapegoat for this regime that, to talk about, in order to seize and consolidate power. And I think it's so important to highlight that they have said the quiet part out loud when the Trump regime is attempting to extort voter registration information from Minnesota. I think that tells us a lot about what this project is actually about. So I think we have two political projects, the white nationalist project, right, that has undergirded the anti-immigration movement for a long time. And what's equally important to recognize is an attempt to use this as a means to consolidate power, including aspects or components that we have seen in authoritarian regimes across time and place, one of which is, of course, using militarized security forces under the control of a concentrated executive. And that is, I think, really important for us to be highlighting right now.
I think all three of you in different ways have spoken to how this moment really shows us, different sectors and factions of the right that, sometimes have aligned agendas and sometimes can be in conflict. Ethan, you named the kind of clash between this more nativist wing of the MAGA movement and a kind of more old school, Reaganite, neoliberal, politics. There are portions of the MAGA movement today, and for example, or portions of, the capitalist class that might not be fully on board with, the most, draconian, of the anti-immigrant, agendas, whether, for their own self-interested purposes of they depend on, non-legal, labor, which they can drive down wages and offer no protections, or, even, parts of the kind of, the tech oligarchy, want to preserve legal immigration, whereas the more hardline nativists, now their latest frontier is to ban even legal immigration out of an explicit desire, to preserve, white America, racial and cultural homogeneity that they imagine they want to, reimpose on the nation. I think it's important to kind of look at the ways that different parts of the right might sometimes be in conflict. I mean, even in the last week and a half after the murder of Alex Preddy, we've seen some tepid voices on the right start to offer some pushback and question. And we've also seen liberals and centrists start to speak up in a new way. Hillary Clinton just wrote an op-ed yesterday that, so obviously people like that are not our allies in most senses of the term, but there also might be, some real opportunities to drive wedges, on the right, to encourage people whose politics might be changing, and to, support others who are trying to, slow down or block the consolidation of authoritarianism, even in spaces where we normally are not aligned. So, I'm curious, how you think an analysis of these different sectors of the right can help to, inform our block and build strategies in this moment.
Well, I think I think there are absolutely opportunities, and the opportunities are probably of two sorts. One is to figure out what kind of stance that we want to use to deal with folk who are defectors from the MAGA coalition, or quasi-defectors, keeping in mind that to the extent that they're defecting, mostly it's because they're thinking that, oh, maybe the Trump regime actually won't last forever, and what's my role going to be in the coming years? Sort of an entrepreneurial positioning kind of thing. That doesn't mean they can't be useful, but for the most part, we're not going to be working with those types. But in terms of people who have been ordinary people who've been on the margins of the MAGA movement and seeing it as something that they could approve of, and the Trump administration is something they could approve of, I think those people can be peeled back. They can be reached in this kind of moment. This is possible, and probably will not require much more than, it's not going to be outreach and creating like some big coalition with them. It's more along the lines of inviting them in the sense of just not needing to have sort of denunciatory positions towards them. We don't have to cozy up to them. We don't have to. All we have to do is leave them space to operate within the Republican Party, basically. There may be a few defectors even from the Republican Party. I mean, when I say a few, at the sort of level of state legislatures and Congress and so on, maybe one or two or something like that. But that wouldn't be nothing, given how things are divided. But the other thing to keep in mind here is there's a lot of kind of clapping in the liberal and mainstream press that the approval ratings for the regime are very low. They are low if you're talking about winning an election of 50% or something, but there's an astonishing number of people who are still continuing to 100% support the regime. It's something like 40% of the of the electorate. That's an astonishing number for folks who are supporting people who are taking actions that look visual, that have the visual look and feel of outright authoritarian gun thug behavior. I mean, the treatment of fellow citizens, specifically the treatment of white people, to be clear here, um, uh, in ways that are usually reserved for racial enemies in the right wing imagination.
Yeah, it's also worth noting that, approval ratings for a figure like Trump or the GOP might be low from parts of their own base because they want something more fascist, essentially. I mean, there's one thing that we're hearing from folks like Nick Fuentes or Steve Bannon right now is real fear that if we can believe it, that the administration is not going hard enough, right? That they are not deporting enough migrants, that they aren't deploying enough, brutal crackdown against, protesters on the left, and they see it as the administration is too captured by this more weak neoliberal GOP establishment. So yeah, we definitely don't want to, confuse disapproval for people coming to our side, and we also need to be attuned to the different splits on the right and ways that, for however terrible it is right now, it can also get worse, and there are people waiting in the wings, who want to attempt something even worse. So I guess to move us along, we've heard from calls in recent days from figures like FBI Director Kash Patel or Stephen Miller to crack down on what they're calling, domestic terrorism in the wake of Minneapolis. These renewed calls that really we've heard since the Charlie Kirk assassination, but obviously long before that, to use terrorism charges, lawfare, RICO charges, and these narratives of outside agitators, of having to put on an insurrection as, a pretext to criminalize our movements and to deploy even more fascistic levels of authoritarian, crackdown. So how can we understand these threats, both in the long arc of the state, always wielding this kind of language and this kind of legislation to repress our movements and to repress, dissent, and also where could it be going? How can we prepare? On the one hand, without dialing back and demobilizing out of fear, while also being prepared for this and understanding the threat and realizing where our power lies in resisting it.
To your point, Ben, one of the things that we do at PRA is to expose the strategy of authoritarian and anti democratic actors and movements. And if we analyze what they're actually attempting here, it becomes really obvious that what they're doing here is a standard maneuver of authoritarian regimes to chill dissent and attempt to eliminate resistance to their efforts to consolidate their power. Authoritarians are typically not able to exert total control over the population, so they weaponize fear and hope that we'll do their work for them. And they don't have to go after everyone to do this. They just have to go after a few people and make an example out of them, especially vulnerable individuals or public figures, to retaliate against them for their public opposition or challenging the regime and their proxies, which in this case is ICE in cities that they're occupying, like an occupying force. And this is something that we've seen in Chicago during Midway Blitz, the federal immigration surge that we saw throughout the fall here in Chicago. And a key example I'm thinking of here is the federal case against the Broadview Six, who are facing fabricated charges of federal conspiracy to impede. And what happened here is that a large group of protesters was gathered outside the Broadview Center. This is late September, which is a DHS facility that is supposed to be a processing center, but has been used unlawfully as a de facto detention center with notably horrible conditions. And, 100, 200 protesters had been gathering regularly outside this facility. And that day, they were 100 or 200 gathered to protest against the abduction of our neighbors, the inhumane conditions being reported in the facility, and the lack of due process that was occurring throughout this operation and at the facility. And at one point, a federal agent drove their vehicle through the crowd, pushing its way through, 100 yards through the crowd. Well, fast forward a few weeks later, and six individuals have found themselves indicted with a federal conspiracy to impede law enforcement charges for allegedly blocking that vehicle. And this is becoming a go to charge, this federal conspiracy to impede that the federal government is trying to use against protesters. They're generally failing to get it to stick, and that's mostly because protesting together is not a conspiracy. That is, fundamental First Amendment protected speech and activity. But what's notable about this case, and what I wanted to highlight here, is that DHS carefully cherry picked six particular individuals to charge who, did not know each other, but who all had something in common, which is that they were Democratic political figures or public figures who had publicly criticized Midway Blitz and or the Trump regime. And these included folks like a local government representative, a congressional candidate and her staffer, and even a local musician who had been playing her guitar at the protest. And among these folks are some of the kindest, smartest, most creative, wholesome individuals you'll ever meet. And they are now facing up to 6 years in prison for standing up for their neighbors. But the federal prosecution is having a hard time in this case getting the charges to stick because they're having trouble providing any basic facts of an actual conspiracy. And that's because the case isn't about facts. It's a blatant attempt to intimidate and repress vocal dissent through criminalization of protest and to publicly persecute in a high profile way these public figures to set a nationwide precedent. And again, this is textbook authoritarian playbook stuff. They can't arrest everyone who disagrees with them, so they pick a few people, especially highly visible ones like political candidates and community leaders, and charge them with serious felonies to send a message to everyone else that if you speak up, this could be you. So this is about manufacturing fear, making examples out of people in order to chill speech across entire communities. And it's also about draining resources because, of course, creating spurious lawsuits that take time and money to fight, even if they're a baseless case, drains our ability to, organize and continue to resist and to dissent. And it's also clearly about retaliation here. Uh, This is how you control a population without having the resources to surveil and arrest everyone. You terrorize a few so that we police ourselves into silence. But the only way that this works is if we don't see right through it. And I think people are seeing through it, right? Led by especially those who have faced criminalization and repression through fear in this country for a long time, as well as those who have this experience abroad.
Yes, this is a key authoritarian tactic, and the other component. I mean, fear is the key authoritarian tactic. This is another one. Ben, how does an authoritarian change a light bulb?
How, Stephen?
They don't. They use gaslighting.
Ah, took me a second there.
Yeah, the point being they want to establish an alternative universe of quote unquote facts, and they want you to believe them because this is what you're being told. So I'm, consulting on some prosecutions as an expert witness, where the DOJ is coming in and saying, well, if someone fired a shot or did something at a demonstration, anyone who helped to plan that demonstration is liable for potential RICO or conspiracy charges. And the kind of evidence that they're using is, well, they brought a first aid kit. They scouted the area ahead of time. They advised people to leave their phones at home So clearly they were up to something nefarious, as opposed to like many of these things you would do if you were planning a scout the area, bring a first aid kit and so on. You would do if you were planning a corporate picnic or a parade. This is just due diligence. And it's similarly with the impeding, keeping in mind that the things they're trying to call impeding federal law enforcement are blowing whistles and shouting and calling names and even bringing guns in the state of Minnesota. This is not illegal. None of these things are illegal. In fact, trying to prevent them from happening, that's a violation of the most basic U.S. law. So it is the federal officials who are almost always in preemptive violation of law, and they're actually having a hard time convincing grand juries that folks should be prosecuted. This is almost impossible. If you'd asked people 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, can a federal prosecutor bring a case to a grand jury and the grand jury will say, no, that makes no sense? People would say, oh, that never happens. I mean, the old joke is any good prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich if they want to. So this is not unprecedented, but the fact that it's happening regularly and that judges are throwing out a lot of this, a lot of these cases is extraordinary. You have to really get into a jurisdiction where they have a deep MAGA-aligned, Trump-appointed Federalist Society judge to contemplate these cases. And this is happening, unfortunately, and there is precedent for these kinds of overwrought conspiracy cases to be brought forward. We need to keep that in mind. But the baseline of activity is such that that the cases that they're going to bring are going to be spectacular. They're trying to use federal law enforcement to intimidate people. Yes, fear. But the other thing that they're talking about doing, border czar Tom Homan in particular, is doxing people. Basically, people who are protesting, exercising First Amendment rights, putting their pictures on their website like they're on some kind of most wanted list or something. And the DOJ is already, contrary to DOJ policy and norms, publishing lists of people who are under investigation, which is an invitation for vigilante reprisals against them. This is clear cases of trying to establish guilt before the fact. All of this is deeply troubling and deeply aligned with an authoritarian progress program, progressive authoritarianism.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I wanted to ask you, Ethan, about Tom Homan. I think we all have been focused on Greg Bovino as an emblem of ICE's authoritarian crackdown right now, and he certainly seems to act the part. But I know Tom Homan is a person who has been really core to the anti-immigrant movement for decades. So can you tell us about Tom Homan and how his rise kind of shows the arc of the movement, and maybe where people like Tom Homan and the broader anti-immigrant movement want to go next in the coming months?
Yeah, so Tom Homan is for all intents and purposes, a lifelong law enforcement official. But I think his current position is pretty telling of what I was speaking about earlier about this kind of this rise of the anti-immigrant movement and its influence within the last, let's say 15 years, to put a decent point on it. Obviously, it extends on either side, but for generally in the last decade and a half or so, Homan was a high-ranking official in Obama's immigration enforcement under during the Obama administration, and for all intents and purposes was considered a mainstream voice on enforcement matters. I think to an extent, at least publicly, he's been a little more radicalized in the last decade or so, as he's worked more closely with anti-immigrant groups, and had the position as acting ICE director during the first Trump administration. But in the interim, I mean, he basically spent 4 years palling around with anti-immigrant NGOs, raising money, going to speaking functions, allegedly taking bribes from federal law enforcement officials, selling access to a prospective second Trump administration. And now, he was angling for that job to what ultimately became what he has now, the borders are so-called. And with that, he was full of bombast and fire and brimstone, talking about how he's going to rain down hell on sanctuary cities and stuff like that. So I'm a little troubled by this notion or this presentation of Homan coming in Minnesota and being a like a more moderate voice, or he's going to moderate things. He has said some things like I want federal agents to attempt to de-escalate things. I don't want them interacting with protesters, etc. Which is, I mean, obviously that's a soft bigotry of low expectations if that's the baseline here. But it's unfortunate that that's what's seen as a moderating voice here, and we can't allow this presentation of Homan as a moderate in here, because at the same time he's speaking to law enforcement officials, asking them why aren't you accepting our detainer requests and things like that. Going up against these sanctuary policies in state. And the sheriffs, many in like rural Minnesota counties he had reportedly met with, I believe yesterday or this morning, saying that we can't accept these. They're illegal. We'll get taken to court. There's 20 years of case law around this that says this. And the anti-immigrant movement has known this for decades. It's a willful misunderstanding or mispresentation of sanctuary policies and the legality of ICE practices well before the second Trump administration. This has long been settled by courts in this area. It's not to say they are going to continue to push it and make things more extreme, but it's reflective of a general misunderstanding of current case law and the way immigration policy works. And they're continuing to push it and make it more punitive than it already is. But so Homan certainly fits in that. He's certainly a product of the contemporary anti-immigrant movement's influence on the right. There's no doubt about that. And we can't lose sight of that as he takes a more public position or becomes the public face of the administration's enforcement actions in Minnesota.
All three of you have talked about how, in addition to the very real and concrete goals of the anti-immigrant movement and the goals of authoritarian consolidation, so much of this also is about attempting to demobilize resistance by projecting fear. And Annie, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about that tactic and maybe some lessons that you've learned from your work on the ground in recent months and from what you've seen about how we can maybe expect that tactic to continue to be deployed, and also how we can remain brave and resilient in the face of it.
Thanks, Ben. I think that is the question for us right now. When I think about fear, we're obviously seeing the attempt to chill speech, to chill dissent, to chill protest. We can understand the escalation of federal conspiracy charges as a tool of intimidation that is, attempting to chill the upswell of resistance that we're seeing in Minneapolis and across the country. But I find hope in the fact that it's not working. We talk a lot about making violence backfire at PRA, and I think that's precisely what we're seeing. Every time someone, a federal agent murders a legal observer or an immigrant at a traffic stop, more people come out of their homes to protest. More people sign up for trainings to learn how to become rapid responders or engage in mutual aid to support their community. And that is what gives me hope, because what I am seeing is a massive response of solidarity and engagement and investment in protecting and defending each other and each other's and our neighbors. And I think that one story that I think about, it comes from a faith leader, again from Minneapolis, who was outside the Whipple building singing "I Am Not Afraid." And in response, a federal agent took him into custody and roughed him up a little bit, put him in a van, and then said to him, "Well, how about now? Are you afraid now?" And his response was no, because I know that what we are doing is right and that we are standing up for justice. And I take a lot of inspiration from that story because I think it's a it's a microcosm of the greater resistance that we're seeing across the country. That fear is not going to work. It isn't working. And I'm just deeply inspired by the way in which everyday people of all walks of life across racial, gender, class, and geographic differences are coming together to stand together.
I think it's the kind of stories that Annie just related that give me hope. But also, I think that we see folk in the universe of organizing and work in which we work, the Fight the Right world, the pro-democracy, the anti-authoritarian work, the human rights and civil rights lawyers. Everyone is stepping up. Everyone is doing everything they can. I haven't seen this level of activity and understanding that what they're doing is supporting a movement. They are not the movement. So the movement support networks are engaged, and even though in some cases funding is drying up, as some of the foundations are withdrawing funding out of fear because they are not like that minister. They are worried about their endowments and their legal cases and whatever the heck else. But in our world, people are fully engaged. They're working late. They're doing everything they can, and it's nice to know that we have colleagues and that we can help folk on the ground by supporting them for whatever they're asking for to the extent that we are able. And so that gives me hope that this is an ongoing project, and that we may see, even as the heavy enforcement withdrew from Chicago and moved to Minneapolis, even bigger, and now it's supposedly going to be transformed into something else. We'll see what comes next, but if it's anything other than a further attempt to increase the authoritarian concentration of power in the administration, I will be shocked. And if there is anything less than a full throttled response from people on the ground wherever it hits, I will also be shocked. So I think hope is built into how I'm looking at this.
Yeah, I mean, your great piece, Ben, illustrated, the sort of dismay that a lot of folks on the right are, experiencing as they witness what's occurring in Minnesota. I have the exact opposite reaction. I'm in awe. I'm astoundingly inspired by what I see and what I hear from people in Minnesota and elsewhere. Midwest solidarity is a beautiful and powerful thing, and Midwest solidarity in the middle of January up against authoritarian forces is inspiring it to a degree that I didn't even know Midwest Solidarity could extend that far, to be honest. Oh, we should also mention real quick that it's gone unnoticed so far, but that solidarity, that organizing led to the first general strike that we'd seen in decades. And that alone we should be naming that, recognizing that is a true expression of power that I don't think any of us have seen in our lifetimes.
Hear, hear.
I'm reminded of a turn of phrase that Kelly Hayes used in a piece that she wrote after, being involved in organizing for several months in Chicago during the heights of our own federal occupation here in Chicago. And what she said is that Chicagoans run towards danger. And we could be running away from danger because the fear is real, right? The punishment, the tactic of making examples out of people, raising charges, murdering people in the street. We could be running away, but we're not. People are running towards danger. They're running towards their neighbors. They're running towards solidarity. And those tactics of division that the federal government is clearly trying to use are not working. And that is the thing that keeps me going. I'm seeing it's an interesting position to have seen this firsthand occur in Chicago and later roll out in Minneapolis in ways that are, multiplied. In fact, Chicago is a much larger area. And we had at the height of federal immigration Operation Midway Blitz, several hundred agents, and in Minneapolis they're dealing with several thousand agents in an area that is much smaller. But what I see is the same evolution um, of a sort of collective experience that we witnessed and experienced here in Chicago, of just the incredible emotional ties towards community that are just moving, and lasting and enduring. And so it's interesting and also wonderful to see that occurring in Minneapolis, just as it did here in Chicago. Folks running towards danger for each other, with each other.
Yeah, I also really love that idea of running toward danger and, in a way, running towards fear. I was thinking about this a moment ago when you shared the words of that faith leader who said, "I'm not afraid." And it's really beautiful, but I also found myself wanting to acknowledge that this is a scary time and the fear is real for so many of us, obviously more for some than others across our different positionalities. But for all of us organizers, all of us doing the various work of resistance, the fear is real right now. Growing up in Hebrew school, we often sang a song that is from the teaching of a rabbi named Rabbi Nachman that goes, "The whole entire world is a very narrow bridge. And the main thing to recall is to have no fear at all." This is a very popular song and it's very beautiful, but the older I got, the more that I didn't really like that last line. The main thing to recall is to have no fear at all, because I was like, well, we do have fear in our lives. That's the truth. And I was really happy to learn one day that actually it's a change from the original words that Rabbi Nachman used. It's the song I sung in Hebrew school goes lo lefached, which is have no fear, but the real Hebrew that he originally used is lo yipached, and that's kind of a singular reflexive verb tense that means don't frighten oneself. And one way to interpret that is don't get too much in your own head, don't be too neurotic. But it's also, I was thinking as you were saying that another way to read it is don't be afraid alone. Don't withdraw into isolation in your fear. Share your fear. Be afraid together. And I think what you're describing is the process of people coming together and, like that faith leader said, transcending our fear to a point where by recognizing that we're all in this together and we're in a sense all afraid together, we can in some sense transcend our fear. So I want to say thank you to the three of you for coming here and having this conversation today in the midst of such a busy time, for doing the work to inform our resistance. And to everyone, I want to say thank you for listening and for all the work you're doing right now to resist.
Thanks, Ben, for bringing us all together.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you for listening to Inform Your Resistance with PRA. The podcast is produced by Olivia Lawrence Wildman, and Frank Lawrence created our music. If you haven't already, rate, review, and subscribe. If you appreciate our work, please consider donating to Political Research Associates at politicalresearch.org. And the best thing you can do to help us is tell your comrades about the pod. Resisting authoritarianism is better with friends. Until next time.